Thank you so much for having me here. We're here, of course, to talk about a remarkable film, The Infiltrators from 2019, which gives us the chance today to meet two of the key people behind that production, but also to talk about what led to that film and the work that the film has done in recent years. I want to start by thanking the great folks at CSREA for the opportunity to be here with you today from where I am here in New Haven, Connecticut. Big thanks to Trisha Rose, Stephanie LaRue, Trey Alston-Swan, Saraya McPherson, and Caitlin Rose. As all of you know, CSREA is a terrific place and one of the most important academic centers in the Academy today, a supporter of great scholarship and teaching, a supporter of the arts, a convener of important conversations, and a real leader in higher education. I'm excited to have the opportunity today to introduce the two filmmakers who created The Infiltrators. They're both remarkable leaders in contemporary Latinx arts with deep experiences prior to working on the film that we'll be talking about today. First is Cristina Ibarra, a Sundance award-winning filmmaker with a 20-year practice rooted in her border-crossing roots along the Texas-Mexico border. Cristina's previous works include 2014's Las Martas, a documentary about wealthy South Texas border debutantes who honored George Washington in Laredo, Texas. Anyone interested in border history and culture, and in particular in Laredo and Nuevo Laredo, needs to watch that film, Las Martas. Everyone should also see 2008's The Last Conquistador, about the racially conflicted construction of a monument to a conquistador in El Paso, Texas, and her award-winning 2000 directorial debut, entitled Dirty Laundry, a homemade telenovela. Cristina's work has been widely celebrated and seen. She's the recipient of fellowships from Soros, Rauschenberg, Rockefeller, NYFA, CPB, PBS, NALIP, Firelight, the Sundance Women's Initiative, and Creative Capital, among others. Our second speaker today is Alex Rivera, a filmmaker who's been telling new, urgent, and visually adventurous Latino stories now for more than 20 years. Alex's first feature film, a cyberpunk thriller set in Mexico called Sleep Dealer, won awards, including the Waldo Salt Screenwriting Award at the 2008 Sundance Film Festival and the Amnesty International Award at the Berlin International Film Festival. Recent collaborations by Alex include a series of music videos produced by the National Day Laborer Organizing Network, NLUN, with artists including Manu Chao and La Santa Cecilia. Working in Southern California and New York and elsewhere, Alex's work has been supported by the Ford Foundation, the Tribeca Film Institute, the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, the Open Society Institute, Sundance, Creative Capital, and many others. He studied at Hampshire College and was the Rothschild Lecturer at Harvard University. So welcome and big thanks to both of you, Cristina and Alex. You know, I know that we're gonna have a great conversation for the next roughly 50 minutes together. And while we're having that conversation, I'm gonna ask everyone watching here today to do us the favor of submitting questions to Alex and to Cristina using the Q&A function here in Zoom. You're going to be hearing about topics that interest you, and you're going to want to hear more about those topics that Cristina and Alex are already discussing. But you're also going to realize over the course of the coming minutes that we aren't quite touching upon the topics that really interest you most, that you'd like to hear one or both of them speak about in greater detail. So please do use the Q&A and send your questions our way. We'll get to those, I think, a little bit after 5 Eastern time. So put those questions in the Q&A. We have a terrific opportunity today to talk about The Infiltrators and about the topics that the film raises for our collective consideration. For the first part of our time together, I'm going to be pitching questions to Cristina and Alex, and they basically, I think, fall into roughly 4 topics or 4 categories. I'm going to be asking them about their own biographies, how their past work and their interests shaped this film, how they think about the crimmigration system in the US that created places like the Broward facility depicted in the Infiltrators in the film. I'm going to ask them how they think about the struggle to decriminalize immigration in the United States and how they made this film in partnership with activists working in that important struggle. I'm going to ask them how they actually created this film as artists, experienced filmmakers, of course, but also people, I'm sure, facing artistic challenges with this production that were new to them. You know, and finally, I'm going to ask them about the aftermath of the film's completion. What's happened to some of the people in this film? What's happened to some of the struggles depicted in this film since the conclusion of this production? How has also the documentary fared in the world since it's released? Now, we have not discussed this, right, Cristina and Alex? We haven't gone through the motions here. We haven't pre-screened any questions. So we'll just see how this goes. But I'm really excited to be in conversation with you. And I thought I would just open by asking you first, if you could talk a little bit more about your careers and how you came to work together on this project in particular.
Hi there. I'll start that one. So great to be here. Thank you very much for your thoughtful structuring and intro of the project. You know, I'm really happy to present this with Alex. It's our first film together. We on our own have been making work separately, like you explained. And the way I came to film was just by really feeling this absence, you know, and wanting to see someone who looked like me represented. I grew up in El Paso, Texas, and I would go to Juarez every weekend to see my family. But whether it was the TV airwaves from Mexico or from the US, I never saw brown people. I never saw someone who just spoke like me or thought about things that I, you know, cared about for the most part. And so that's what I was thinking about when I ran across film. I guess I'm more of an accidental filmmaker in that I went to school to study law and I came out a filmmaker, much to my parents' dismay. But because of that, I've been interested really in the border since the beginning. It's really what brought me to film. So all of my questions that I raised through filmmaking have been about where I'm from, not just geographically, but also the history, the legacy that we've inherited, and also the metaphoric space, because it's not just, like in the, it's not just the Texas-Mexico border, but there's this idea of the border that informs the way I look at the world and how I try to choose my storytelling styles. So, after a few films, I ended up being filmless, in a way, homeless. And I was ready to really take on a new film. And at the same time, I was pregnant and Alex and I have a child together. So we really decided that we would really try to make film a homeland of sorts for our little filmmaking family. And this was something that we both were thinking about often, is the border, representations of immigrants. And it's really how we came across what the activists were doing when they were doing something groundbreaking. Just one last thing I'll say about this is that I saw in what they were doing images of my own, an alternate life that my father could have lived, because he was undocumented when he was that age. And so I would always ask myself, like, what would it have been like had he become friends with these young radical immigrants who could not be contained? But anyway, these are the questions that Alex and I started to think about when we came together to think about film.
Yeah. And so in terms of the where we're coming from, I mean, I think Cristina and I share a lot, but also have very different backgrounds. And I was born in New York City. My dad is from Peru. My mom is Irish American, white, from Brooklyn. And so I grew up kind of in a sort of Peruvian American scramble. And when I went to college, got acquainted with sort of critical race theory, started to look at the world. In the mid-90s, the immigration wars seemed to be at a fever pitch. Back then, I thought it was maximum. You know, when I started to understand my place in the world as a child of recent immigrants, Latin American immigrants, brown-skinned immigrants. And in the mid-1990s, there was Prop 187 in California. The border wall was being built under President Clinton. NAFTA was being enacted to liberalize and connect economies while the border wall was going up. The Zapatistas were emerging, highlighting these contradictions and calling for a globalization from below, un mundo donde quepa muchos mundos. And so I thought that it seemed like interrogating immigrants' place in America was like an interesting thing to do in the mid 90s when I started. And I started to make work there, and the immigration battles, it turned out, were not at the fever pitch then. They were just getting started. And so for the past 25 years, it's been kind of fascinating watching these kind of fault lines in our national discourse around the contours of the nation, who's in, who's out, what places do people what places do people belong inside of power, inside of privilege, inside of access to this thing we call America. And so it's been, anyway, so that's sort of like that's been some of the questions that have framed my work over the past 25 years. And when I met the people who would become the Infiltrators, because I met the young activists who formed the National Immigrant Youth Alliance, I met them when they had just begun to perform these acts of radical civil disobedience, civil disobedience by undocumented youth. This is before DACA, when undocumented youth had no formal protection in this country, and they were going into the street and getting arrested and saying with their bodies that they were done waiting for change and they were going to force the Obama administration. This was happening during 2010, roughly around 2010 was when this started, forced the Obama administration in front of the news cameras to make a choice: either deport these sort of sympathetic students wearing caps and gowns, or give some protection, but do it. You have to do it now, administration. They were saying, not tomorrow, let's not talk. You make a decision now, and we're going to force you to make a decision with our bodies. And when I saw that in the news, it seemed revolutionary, because it was revolutionary in a deep sense. In world history, my understanding is there's undocumented people and stateless people in many jurisdictions, but there had never been undocumented civil disobedience until this group started that process in Arizona in 2010. So that's when we met them. That's when we were starting this sort of film family. We started to work with them. And that's how we ended up with them in 2012, when they decided to do this kind of radical action, which is the core of our film, the infiltration of the Broward Detention Center.
Yeah, thank you for setting things up that way. That's really helpful to think about the roots of this film, both in the 1990s, at least for you, Alex, and you know, in your own kind of personal story growing up in El Paso Juarez, Cristina, but also in some of the activism that was emerging around 2010. And some of there's probably precedents for that prior to 2010 as well, but certainly was a really important moment. Can I ask you, so the film opens with the scenes of the militarized border at night, which I think really is a very kind of interesting, important way. I think that I imagine that you're trying to set up our understanding of what will come in the film. So, you know, you probably considered other ways to open this film, but I wonder about the choices that you made there in the framing, why you use the images that you do, why at night, anything else you can tell us about the opening of the film and how it maybe reflects what you've been talking about, the kind of interest that you brought to the film, your commitments.
So yeah, so right on. That opening was kind of crafted pretty late in our process, but in terms of why open with these kind of what images that are intended to look kind of like infrared or night vision, and of the border wall itself was, number one, the border wall is not big in our film. It's not where the action unfolds. It's not, but it's this thing that is a supercharged symbol. It's what we're presented constantly in the nightly news as, like, this is what immigration looks like. Here's a wall, here's people jumping over it. This is immigration. And I think we were interested in, I'll speak for myself, I guess I was interested in getting this symbol that people recognize. It's like the thing you can kind of hold on to, you know, in terms of icons of immigration. It's an icon, and flipping it. And we flip it by having a voiceover from the first person point of view. So you're seeing these characters moving through this desert landscape, transgressing the wall. They're made anonymous through the infrared technology. And then the voice comes in and de-anonymizes. There's a name, there's a family, there's a story, and crucially, there's an attitude, which is, I don't care what you call me. You know, he said, undocumented, illegal, I don't care what you call me. You know, and that was so important, just to sort of put this on the table. The audience can think they know where they are. They've seen this image 1,000 times, and then what? You haven't seen it like this. And so, and that just felt like a good gesture, again, giving the audience a place to stand that was familiar, but then disrupting it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's great answer. I just wanted to add one little thing that isn't apparent, but that is where the images come from. You know, that the images were made by the Department of Defense to offer up to journalists who are doing, you know, it's like their PR department. So one of the things that I really love is to be able to use something that was created for this purpose and then turning it and critiquing it. You know, it's like really, it's not really part of the film, but it's just, you know, something in the background that I love about what we did to put the film together, that we took their footage.
Well, and I love that you brought up those first words of the film. And I do think that they're so, you know, it's probably the wrong word to use, arresting, you know, in the context of the visuals. I mean, I think you have, you know, Marco saying everyone needs a plan, right? That's what my mom told me when she was carrying me north of the border. And then he goes on to say, I'm 22 years old and still undocumented, illegal. I don't care what you call me, really. They're all just other words for afraid. So I love the fact that you introduced those kind of, as you said, like, you know, the strong narration there from the beginning, the attitude, but also these key terms that I think do circulate in popular discourse about migrant people in this period. How did you come to that, to those words from Marco? Did you prompt him, or where did that come from?
I mean, so this is where we start to get into the hybrid style of the film a little bit, because it was a collaboration in the sense that we proposed some writing, and Marco was able to read it and say, you know, yes, this is something I would say. But it was like a circular process where we generated and
Listening.
Yeah, you're right. I should take a step back and just start it from listening to him and trying to, you know, put words into his mouth, really, you know, like we were trying not to do that. We were trying, but that's really what happens is, like, you know, we wrote, we presented, but it started from listening. And within that, if we get deeper into the filmmaking process, you know, there was another element where there was a workshop that we had, not just with Marco, but with all of the protagonists in the film, where there was a lot more give and take, to like with visually, like using your own bodies. And so it was part of this like philosophy of filmmaking where we wanted to collaborate, you know.
Yeah, and just to put it on a little bit of a linear timeline, like it started off as a normal documentary where we thought we were going to film one of these actions that I was describing earlier, and kind of normal documentary language, and then that would be the film. But then when they went and did many more actions, kept going, and we kept filming, and then they did this infiltration, because half of the infiltration happens inside the detention center, and that was really where a lot of the decisions were being made, key relationships were forming. The story was unfolding behind the walls of the detention center, and we as documentarians were outside. And so to tell that true story that we were there witnessing, we had to turn to some language of writing to write what we could not perceive with the documentary camera. And so we entered this land of recreation in that kind of binary way of like, outside the detention center, we'll be filming with the documentary camera. Inside, we'll use actors and script and kind of recreate. But then we started to realize they could kind of
Cross the border.
Yeah, cross a border. The membrane between these forms could permeate and be permeable in ways. And the voiceover from Marco was the last thing. It was like seemed like the most forbidden gesture to script from the actor's point of view, using the actor's voice. That's not Marco's voice, it's the actor playing Marco. So that the actor Marco is sort of centered as the main character of the film, and his voice is scripted. As Cristina mentioned, we'd spent a lot of time around them listening to how they talk regarding the word illegal, for example. Before them, I had been tracking the I word campaign and a pretty mass movement to try to get the word illegal removed from the popular vocabulary and from the AP style guide. when I went and hung out with them, they were calling each other illegal all the time. You illegal, you messed up my eggs for breakfast. But they were all undocumented, just playing with that term with this kind of punk abandon. That was so American to me and so cool. Like, so, like, it's part of how we work with language in our popular culture, that terms that are used to denigrate can get flipped around and become a current of cool. And they were flipping language around in ways that were really funny and like surprising and human. So in any case, we'd listen to that. We did long interviews. We did these workshops that Christina's mentioning where the protagonists got together, Claudio, Marco, Viri, Mohammed, in New York, and we showed them a rough cut of the film so they could see it. So there's all this kind of feedback between our process and their process. And the same with scripting of this voiceover. So to answer, it's a long answer to your question, but that voice and the sort of language of it, we wrote it inspired by what they had said and what we had seen. He reviewed it and it was recorded by the actor playing him, but it let us have a kind of precision with language.
And the actor and Marco also spoke.
Yeah. So there's all these feedback mechanisms in the process, but having that scripted voiceover let us do certain dramatic and textural work that needed to be done quickly and powerfully, and that let us center our character and give them film a point of view that we felt it needed.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And what I'm hearing you say is that you were quite intentional in the process, and you came to this with a philosophy, but perhaps not a plan in a certain way, ironically, that you were sort of looking to develop that plan in consultation and in collaboration, with the people who were involved, with the people from the National Immigrant Youth Alliance in particular. How did their thinking about the project change over time? Did they have a strong view of what this ought to look like from day one? Were they open to the project when you first talked to them about it? And did their own sense of how this might look on screen change dramatically over time, or remain relatively the same?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it did evolve definitely. The first stage of the process, I feel like there were many doubts on their part that it would actually even become a film because it took so long. And they are storytellers in their own right. They're like master storytellers. And so they work with media all the time. And this was just a different, I guess it broke their expectations in some ways, because they just figured the film would have been done like within the year or 2 years. So, we would go back to them often throughout that time to get the interviews, at different stages of the process. And I feel like a real turning point happened when we did our workshops in New York, because when we realized in the edit room that we couldn't make a straightforward film because of the limitations that we had, and that we were going to have actors specifically, and there was going to be this hybrid form. We realized that we had to tell them, because it just became a moral question at that point. It's like, is this a documentary still, right? And so that was a really difficult part of the process, because it was the most risky. We could have lost their interest completely, or the opposite happened, which was great, but it was we didn't know what to expect, which is that they embraced the cut and tried to play with it. It's like, okay, well, that's not really exactly how it happened. Let's play this out. And then we role played and had workshops. And so there was this moment where it felt so right, like we were going back and forth. And there was this conversation around distribution too, like explaining like how film works, at least independent film, and explaining, we don't know what's going to happen. This could happen, or, something else could happen. And then I think then once they realized that we did this change, they then get even more involved, in doing like recording lines that we missed. And so I would say they were embracing the adventure. And then they went to Sundance and to the premiere.
But I would just say that the documentarian and subject relationship is always fraught, and is always, I think there's always a power imbalance there. you can never be someone else. They can never be us. We can never be them. And the thing that's being created kind of sits in between, because it's like the film would never exist without the subject. It would also never exist without the filmmaker. Who does the film truly belong to? It kind of sits in between, but in terms of like legally, there's no in between. It has to belong to somebody, So my point though is just that the relationship between a writer, a storyteller, and their subject is always fraught. And you can try to, and I think we tried to do things to acknowledge that and to bring them in and explain the process, explain what we were making, show what we were making, which in the land of documentary, traditional documentary, to show a rough cut to the subject, you don't do that really. But in this case, because we'd entered the landscape of writing for the reasons that we've talked about earlier, we're in the landscape of writing. And if you think about like kind of writing a biopic, for example, like the world of Hollywood biopics, that's actually kind of common for the real person to be on set and providing guidance to the art department or the cast or the writers and the directors. So we kind of went sort of from an ethical and relationship structure of the normal documentary, where there's some distance between the maker and the subject, into something more like a kind of biopic where the subject is feeding back into the writing and directing process. But it was tricky and weird.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think once they were at Sundance, and it was really clear that they felt it was a representation of a true representation of their work. I think then just after that, we have a strong relationship with some and not with others. And, that's just because ultimately, like, what we have going for us is that we did our best to do a fair and accurate representation.
No, it sounds like an amazing process. And certainly the final product is, incredibly impressive. You haven't talked as much about the actors per se. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about, how did you find these people? Who are these people? Manuel Alvarado, Chelsea Rendon, and the rest. And what was their perspective on the story that they were helping you to tell? And how did their perspective and understanding of what they were doing change over time? Do you have any sense?
Sure. So we worked with this film, like Cristina was mentioning, took a super long time. Like the original events of the story, 2012, the film premiered 2019. That's 7 years. It was a long process, and we can explain why. But the reason I'm mentioning it is because we filmed with the actors in August of 2018. So way at the end of this whole long process. And it was a long process that then in the very end was extraordinarily rushed. Like we finally got the financing that we needed to do the reenactments in around May, found a producer. We were summer 2018, thinking about Sundance 2019, 6 months later, and having to produce this whole thing, all the recreations, then the final edit in about 6 months. And so we worked with a casting director. There was no way to find, there were 24 speaking parts in the movie, 24 actors. How are you going to find them all? The only way to do it was a casting director. So we worked with a casting director named Carla Hull, she did like Coco, Narcos, a lot of the Latino Hollywood productions. She's a casting director. And so that's her specialization. And so we had, we just do what you do for making a movie. We wrote little character descriptions, casting calls. We had certain assets like the real pictures of the real people, where there were real kind of doppelgangers that we were trying to kind of roughly match. And incredibly, Carla Hull and her staff found the cast. I mean, we went from 0 to 24 in, I think, roughly two weeks. It was about 2 weeks of just seeing as many people as we could. And some of them had track records. Chelsea, who plays Viri, has, she was in a TV show called Vida. She was in a movie called The Better Life. But she's been, if you look at her resume, she's been in a lot of productions. Manuel Uriza, who played Claudio, the same. Maynor Alvarado, who plays Marco, is more of a newcomer. But there were all people who had been been working in the industry, and they were all in the union. You know, we had to make the decision. And once you go SAG, you know, the Screen Actors Guild, all the actors have to be that. And so they were all, you know, you see, because they're in the guild and so they act a lot, you see like the guards in our movie being the guards in like other movies, because they're always appearing, the same actors.
Gonna look.
Yeah.
One other thing that the actors had once they were cast is they had documentary scenes as evidence to kind of, you know, do some research that had to happen quickly. There were calls that happened between the actor and the real person that the actor was portraying. But I think that probably the most challenging role was probably Manuel Uriza's, who was Claudio. Only if only because Claudio was the one who we invited everyone from, you know, all of the infiltrators and Claudio to come to set. Claudio was able to come. And so Manuel had his personal dialect coach slash art department person slash like script supervisor. Like Claudio did every department basically.
Yeah, Claudio came and was with us for a month, basically the month of production. Stayed at our house here, just right down the hall here, and was with us for a month, and advising on every aspect of the production, but very heavily advising the actor who was playing him.
Who was watching him act.
Who was watching, Claudio was watching the monitor and giving feedback. So it was very, in terms of the feedback that we're talking about, it was maximum.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, yeah, no pressure, right? I mean, you know, I'm glad, Alex, that you mentioned there were 24 speaking parts. I didn't count, but, you know, one of the things I thought of when I watched this film most recently is that it must have presented challenges for you all as filmmakers to tell so many stories and to figure out how to manage all of these different characters and their, you know, personal backgrounds. I mean, how did you think about managing multiple characters like, you know, like Marco, Viri, Claudio, Radam, Emiliano, Ismael? I mean, you managed to bring all of these people into the frame in a relatively short amount of time, you know, give most, if not all of them, backstories. And, you know, it seems to me, you know, to use them to, you know, advance different parts of, you know, what I think you were trying to do. At the same time, I'm guessing that there must have been characters that you didn't represent who were players in some way in you know, in the drama that you were representing. So can you talk about the challenges of, you know, managing all of these characters and how you thought about those challenges as artists?
I mean, I'll just take a quick start and Alex, you can finish it up, but like you're correct in that assessment. Like, I mean, it was just really difficult to find the right balance because there's so many human stories that were so moving. And I guess the way I remember doing this is that it was being guided by the work of the infiltrators, right? And so whenever they had the most access to case, you know, that's where we went, you know, so we just followed their work. Really, they were leading us. And so in that way, we were able to figure out who to portray. Then we had to figure out whether they wanted to be portrayed as the real person, or if we needed to just portray them with an actor, because we had the unintended opportunity to hide people's identities. We didn't think about that when we were first deciding to do a hybrid form, but you know, so there's some people who have are completely
the character Benny, for example, is a made-up name.
Yeah, exactly. So, and you know, that also allowed us for dramatic composite. Like there's one or two composites of characters that are taken from the real work, but you know, they didn't necessarily want to be on camera, so we just ended up kind of consolidating them into one, and that served for dramatic purposes.
It was a lot.
So there were a lot of considerations, but it was really heavy work, like because it was, we wanted to be respectful, but also tell a story, you know, tell one singular story.
Yeah, and I think what you said is so important, which is that these an action like this was a campaign, you know, led by activists who'd done this many times already. The reason they were infiltrating, I mean, like I mentioned earlier, they have this sense of humor. You see in the documentary, they're very scrappy. There's something tender about like how rough-edged the whole project is, but they're also super seasoned, and they've been at it for a while now. And the campaign has a logic to it, and and that logic, from what I understand from other activists, is the logic. You start small, you get a victory, that victory, then you publicize it, it becomes a sort of a recruiting point, an inflection point in the campaign, and it grows. And so it was really, like Christina's saying, the story was about us, I think, reckoning, trying to understand what they'd done. And it had a sort of human and a narrative logic to it that we tried to sort of boil down, and communicate, but every inside the detention center, it's just amazing to me that there's not more films about it, that there's, I think, kind of no films, like there's almost no visual culture about life in detention, because and what's amazing about it is it's incredibly dramatic. It's insane. Like in a prison, people are there, they roughly know a sentence, and we know the system is fraught and rife with abuse and many horrors and things that, but in general, people might know their sentence. They know how long they're in for. Maybe they're going to try to get out earlier. But in detention, people have no idea they don't know if they're there for 2 weeks, 2 years. They don't know what's going to happen. Everyone in there is fighting, in the active process of fighting. If they accepted their deportation, they can sign a voluntary departure and be out pretty soon. So people in detention are in a aspirational or in a kind of space of struggle. And so it's a different kind of incarcerated space narratively. And tuning into that, you just realize this place is an explosion of human drama. And so just going in and, like Cristina said, following the activists, who did they meet? What were they trying to achieve? And trying to just create, like, to your point, there are many stories, but little arcs. Every character has a little arc. And just, we had our big bulletin board, just color coding every character and tracking and making sure that no one got onto the bulletin board who didn't do something, who didn't have an out. And when we listened to the true stories, they all had something at stake. They all had something in motion. And so it was just a lot of work to kind of weave all those storylines together and try to balance them.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I thought about the complexity of the sort of social attachments that you're showing in the film as being one of the things I love most about what you've done. I mean, it's obviously a story of activists against the facility, against GEO, against the larger, complex of laws and regulations and violence that surrounds these people, obviously. But you also do such a beautiful job, in my mind, of representing relationships in really complex ways. I mean, to me, like, Marco's opening words of, invoking his mother, put right on the table from the beginning, family ties and those kind of effective relationships that are really important to some of the people in the film, and we see the strength of those relationships and the bonds between, like, Claudio and Emiliano, obviously, right? But we also see over the course of the film the development of new kinds of solidarities and ties and affection between people, in the struggle, between, activist organizers who are coming together in different ways, between the diverse immigrants in detention, who are not all coming from the same part of the world or speaking the same language, obviously, right? Who are coming together across lines of language and lines of nation and so forth, to rally for Marco's freedom, maybe most dramatically, in the film. But at the same time, that, I think you guys do a wonderful job of showing some of the challenges of any easy narratives about, solidarity and ties. Like, there's the character Nima, who we learn her family life was not a romantic, lovely family life. She, it was one defined by domestic abuse, right? We worry about the informants among, the so-called sapos, who are going to give up the information to the Guardia, right? We see Morales as, a real threat, a fellow Spanish speaker, probably from an immigrant family, who may, is obviously working against the sort of solidarities that bind others. So how did you think about this? How did you think about representing these relationships and their complexities, with family as one part of this, and a very dominant way of representing what's so unjust about, the immigrant system and the carceral system, family separation, but also I think in many ways moving beyond that in the way that you represented these stories. Any thoughts about that?
I mean, it's it's hard to take credit when it's the infiltrators themselves who really led us to think about all of this in that way. But one thing I can just quickly say is Claudio to me seems like this natural leader. He seems like a natural organizer. And the relationship between Marco and Claudio almost feels like father and son. And it's those kinds of relationships maybe that you're speaking about. But yeah, I mean, it was just, it's a documentary. Like that's just, we were just following the story. I don't know if you want to add to that, Alex.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And then, but it's interesting. My previous feature film, Sleep Dealer, the kind of antagonist, the sort of authority figure, is this drone pilot who's Latino also. And people are always asking, why did you make him Latino? And the enforcer character, the authority figure. And I think Cristina has spoken about this too, that if you're on the US-Mexico border, you see Mexican-American Border Patrol agents all the time.
They're the worst.
And they're okay, so
they're so hard.
But what to make, like, we have in this kind of moment of reckoning that we're having in this country around white supremacy, so overdue and so deja vu. I mean, I feel like through the 90s, again, there was an insurgent kind of, and there was an awakening back then that unfortunately didn't really change the systems of power in this country. Hopefully this reckoning changes power more, but I mention it because it is absolutely true that we live in a white supremacist nation, in a settler colonial nation. That is so true. But it is also true that people of color get swept up in in administering that, and in machinations of it, and you see it. You go to the Mexican border, you see the Chicano Border Patrol agents, you see, so, and I find, I don't want to hide that. And I don't want to gloss over that and make like all the police in our movie or all the guards white, because white supremacy. Because number one, it's not true. If you go to the facility, that's not what you see. You see a multiracial
Morales is real.
officer based on a real character. You see a multiracial staff administering this concentration camp. That's what you see. And what do we make of it? Are they dissonance? Are they static? What are the people of color administering these kinds of systems of racial control? Well, to me, I think it highlights that the mentalities of colonialism and white supremacy do not live only in a body that matches, a body that comports with that power system, that those mentalities are so powerful and pervasive that lots of people of different racial expressions can administer them. And I think out of respect for the challenges we face, we have to visualize that, and not put it into a kind of, create in our film work a sort of a vision of a white supremacy that's more simple than the one that we actually live inside, And so I don't know if that answers any question, but I thought it was, anyways, I'll throw it out there.
Yeah, no, I think that's beautiful, as is the idea that, Cristina, that you said, that you were in a sense following the story and following, the example and what you learned from the infiltrators themselves. I think that's really compelling. Can I ask you a little bit more though about, and again, maybe the answer is just you were just reporting what happened in some sense, but how you thought about the idea of resistance in this film and showing what resistance to the current state of affairs looks like? I mean, because you must have had some choices to make here. For example, you show us when Amy Goodman in Democracy Now! Is playing a role, and when Univision, casts a light on this facility. You do draw attention to the Congressman Deutsch and let him have a speaking role in the film. We have Radam, right? The kind of, I think extremely sympathetic, I gather non-immigrant character, who was doing very important work. So you must have had some thoughts as you went about how much screen time to give those, those actors in this story, and how much to give the folks who were doing the work on the inside, the Claudios, the Marcos, and others, attention as you sort of were trying to document what moves the system, and how things are moving in the period in which you're trying to document. Any thoughts about that idea of resistance? And let me ask you a secondary question if you want to take it. Religion plays an important role here too. It's a kind of muted, but when Claudio goes on the fast, he calls it a fast, and he invokes, the walls of Jericho and Joshua here. So there's also something there, I think, that for some people, they may want to be interested in reading this as something important to the immigrant rights movement and the struggles that you're documenting. So any or all of that. Thanks.
It's so much. It's so much. And really, honestly, I think we could frame up a whole hour-long conversation on just what you framed there. Thank you so much. So for the detailed read and tracking all this stuff, because nothing ends up in a film by accident, and so everything you've just mentioned there was the subject of a lot of thought and discussion. For example, I'll just pick a couple, but having Representative Deutsch have a speaking role in the film. We deliberately, for the longest time, wanted no experts and no authorities above or beyond our activist protagonists, because we, as critics of the history of immigration cinema, we both feel like there's not enough portraits of immigrants as protagonists, as authors of their own destiny. But then we realized that, number one, they were working our nation's political system in an incredibly specific and granular way, turning to the local ICE office at a certain point, to the national ICE office at another point, to the local representatives, to the president, to the head of DHS. I mean, they understood the bureaucracy of the American government, elected, unelected, and where to put pressure. And getting into the details of that were part of the pleasure of the film, part of the pleasure of the story, and part of a portrait of their power. And so showing Representative Deutsch acknowledging this group's work and that they had kind of led him into action, I think we thought of it as incredible. That I'm a citizen, I was born here, I've never gotten a congressperson to do anything, but they had, and they can't vote. How do stateless people produce political power? Well, we're going to show you a couple examples. And so that was, to me, the overall mission of the film was, how can stateless people create political power outside of voting? What are the other mechanisms? And you also highlighted the media ecology. They're doing this in Florida, a swing state. In 2012, Obama's up for re-election. Florida may be decisive. Univision, maybe not normally a big power base, but Univision in Florida in an election year, could be the 1% this way or that way. And so they knew that. And so the undocumented group creating these narratives that could be fed into, through their actions, creating narratives that could be fed into the Univision system, which is covering immigration ferociously in Florida in an election year. There's a circuit there to create material political leverage. And then, Amy Goodman followed that and create another power base. But so anyways, mapping all of this stuff out and trying to get it onto the screen in some way where you could sort of see the dominoes that they've set up falling was really, really important,
Yeah, I completely agree. And I see everything that Alex is saying. I think one thing to talk about too, in terms of resistance, is the filmmaking itself, because one of the stresses in making this film was in explaining the choice to reveal the identity of undocumented people. And it was seen as we had mixed responses about that. But in the process, just leaning on the strategy, the sophisticated political strategy of the activists themselves, is really what we were confident in and what we relied on. And so in terms of resistance, I think that idea of just being visible, we were happy to be part of that strategy, not invented by us, but again, taking the lead, but it was a stress, and it did limit our partners and who thought that was a good idea. And it wasn't, you know, we're still in conversation around that idea itself, in other ways that we'll get into soon, I think. But also in the idea that we were embedded with the activists. The idea, like you see all these films where the filmmaker is embedded with the people they're following, and the objectivity isn't questioned. And I feel like that's just another way that we were thinking about resistance and storytelling, is that, you know, we felt strongly that this was a worthy group to be embedded with, and we were going to do it whether people thought it was objective or not.
I think about like a film like Immigration Nation, the Netflix series, embedded with ICE, you know, that embedded with the army, embedded with all these different
And
forces.
they're objective.
And those are, yeah, we were attacked, just to clarify or add dimension to this, you know, but we were criticized at different moments by different funders and different film institutions for not being objective, you know, and but I think, like Christina's pointing out, those questions themselves, I think, have a certain kind of colonial sort of history.
I guess, my ultimate point is just like, even if from a place of privilege, you know, you can still be a part of stories of resistance, you know. It's just, anyway, it's a lot to think about and to talk about, but those are just some of the ideas that come to mind.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, and I you know, I love what you said about how gifted and intelligent and fast moving the activists were in coming to understand the different kind of political levers that could be played on the outside, right? With DHS, with the executive branch, with the legislature, with Univision, with, you know, with Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! I mean, so it feels to me like part of what you're showing is, again, like the creativity and persistence, you know, of these actors. The other thing, though, that really comes through for me is like the knowledge of the cruelty of the system that these people have in a very special way. I mean, and for me in your film, you know, it is that bulletin board with the red, yellow, and green, you know, push pins next to people's names that really, you can, you know, just so horrifyingly shows, you know, the kind of mundane nature of how power is working in a place like that, right? You know, people, you know, Benny suddenly has to write his own name on the board as being up for deportation that evening, right? And people are watching that board to understand their fate that seems very much beyond their control. So this is like just a word of, you know, compliment, I think, more than anything, that I think your film really exposes how people in a facility like that one and others, you know, come to understand the way, you know, power works against them and have an understanding of power that oftentimes many others don't have.
Yeah. It was I mean, all of that was true. I mean, I wish our bulletin board we could talk about that board as a prop, you know what I mean? It was, but it's all based on the actual, the actual thing. There was a nerve center to the detention center, the board on the wall with updates on everybody's cases. Every day people could go and see what was happening, and the whole thing maintained by a detainee workforce, because Geo Group profits off of detainee labor. So, and Benny was all of that is true. And it's like, but it is remarkable how I think a system like the immigration system, many, you know, millions and millions of people caught up in it, massive amounts of, you know, movement, massive amounts of suffering, you know, and you can reckon with it at that scale. But if you zoom down and go into one detention center and go into one place and just talk to people and find, like, within the detention center, that one, where is the thing? And that board was like the nerve center in the whole thing. And to your point, I mean, I think it did resonate to us as like a kind of extraordinary metaphor or visual of, you know, this bureaucracy in action. And this is the crux of it right here. It comes down to this. So, anyways, so to think on these two scales of both the massiveness of the system and then a bulletin board on the wall in a detention center.
You know, one of the other amazing moments in the film for me is when Viri is trying to get inside, right? And of course, she doesn't pull it off the first time. And the second time, when she goes in, she's being coached by Mohammed and practicing how she's going to do this. And, I think Mohammed is telling her to sound more desperate and to, I think he might have used the term whine, to sound, a little bit more high pitched. And she compares getting inside to kind of an act of theater. We have to become the stereotypes that we advocate against in order to do this work of resistance. So I don't know. I mean, how did that happen as filmmakers that you came upon that moment? Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, we had been with them already, like I mentioned, on other actions, and they called us up and said, we're going to do this. And we got on a plane and went there and watching, and this is how they do it. I don't know what to say, except like they had, I had gone with them on an earlier aborted infiltration mission in Alabama. And that was when they first had this idea, because they were, the analysis they shared with me was that they were getting frustrated because they would go and they would have a protest, undocumented youth in a street, get arrested, get taken to a jail, and then ICE would show up and start to intervene. And ICE would say, we're not going to detain these kids. And so the jail would treat them like a normal civil disobedience arrest and let them out the next morning or whatever. And then ICE would come out and say, we don't detain good kids. And then some of these activists had actually been detained by ICE, riding their bike home, driving with a broken taillight. They actually knew that was a total lie. ICE under Obama in the early years was absolutely detaining dreamers and deporting dreamers. And they observed that their actions were being used as a talking point for the administration. And so in Alabama, they had decided what we're going to do is we're going to get some dreamers detained. How? We don't know. We'll send them to a bus stop. We'll have them drive through a stop sign. But their idea was to get some dreamers into detention and then do a public action, have the administration come out and say, we don't detain good kids. And then the activists could say, but aha, we've got 5 of our activists in detention already. The Alabama action did not unfold exactly according to plan. And part of it was really hard for them to get detained on purpose when they wanted to. And so by the time they got to Florida, it was like, okay, we have to kind of walk up and knock on the door to get detained on our terms on the night we want to. And like you see in the film, I mean, they learned that in and of itself, just walking up and saying, I don't have papers, wasn't enough. They had to sort of play the role, and all very logical to end up in a place of total surrealism. I mean, the whole thing's completely upside down.
Yeah, it reminds me of some of the recent academic work that shows just how, for example, the Border Patrol historically has operated on stereotypes about what a Mexican looks like, right? This concept of what Mexican brown is, was really what shaped their profiling in stopping people along roads in Texas and elsewhere from the 1920s forward. So the performance of those categories here becomes, a way to infiltrate too, which is, I think, really interesting. There's a couple questions in the chat. I want to start seeing if I can take some of these. So let me try to combine 2. They're really asking you about how you filmed the center itself. So, one person is asking where, in fact, you did the filming of the detention center scene. So maybe you could talk about that. And then there's also a question about how you got the drone footage of Broward in particular, whether those were your shots or whether you got those from someplace else.
I'll take the first part and you can do the second part, but it just, the facility, when we were talking to Pitti about what it was like to be inside, she described it as feeling like it was inside of a mental institution. It was, those are her words. And what ended up happening is that, we tried a few times to get into Broward itself, and we were denied each time. So we ended up, early on realizing that we were going to have to, find another space to represent Broward. And so we did, we had a locations manager and we looked at some spots, and we ended up realizing that this decommissioned mental institution here in Pomona was in fact going to be the best match we could find at the time. to represent Broward. And so then the question was just like how to try to visually match it as much as possible to what we saw of Broward, which was through the Department of Defense videos and through just visits to their we couldn't get past certain gates, but we went there and we were out, outside of the protests, obviously. So just from what we knew, but that's in fact a set.
It's a set, yeah, a set here in Southern California. So everything with the actor playing Claudio, the actor playing Marco, all of that is in a set. The place is called Lanterman. If you Google Lanterman Developmental Center, I think it's called, here in Southern California, and so it's an old mental institution. The drone footage is actual drone footage of the actual Broward Detention Center, and we tried to label that. Hopefully, I don't know if audience members experienced, if you knew where you were at any given moment, but we hoped to. We didn't want to make this a film about questions of authenticity. We wanted to use what techniques, both the labeling and other aspects of the visual language, to try to make it clear what was real and what was recreated without over labeling it. It's a tricky thing. So hopefully people felt like it was clear, but the drone shots are all of the real place. And how did we get them? They were filmed by somebody flying a drone.
Got it. Okay. I think the question was partly whether that you purchased that stock or not, but I understand the answer to the question. One of my favorite parts of the film comes at the end when, let's see, you said Marco opens up, as we've said, the film with that wonderful voiceover of the border footage from DHS. And towards the end, he says, going into Broward, we jokingly said we were going to bring it to a halt. They aren't trained to deal with people who hold their heads up. Such a beautiful way of putting, what I think was obviously behind so much of the efforts of the infiltrators themselves. I did want to ask you about the tone of the film towards the end. I mean, in the way I saw it, and this is not a critique, but it's just an interesting question. There is a kind of upbeat tone towards the end, as we see people like Marco and Claudio out of Broward, and there's a kind of hopeful nature of, I think what you guys are showing us in the film. And I just wanted to ask about how you thought about that, because I think it is there is, from my perspective, tremendous value in showing these kinds of victories and in showing the power of people like this to do this work, and your role as documentarians to represent that. On the other hand, one might say, this is a story of persistence, not change. This is a story that's gotten worse, not better, since 2016 or 2017. So how did you think about those questions as you were kind of figuring out how the film would end, as you were winding this down?
So, there was this definite change inside of the detention center after Marco left, a real change in attitude. And like you said, I think there's a lot of value in recognizing the successes and the victories. And those were clear, they were really clear. People were organizing and they weren't before. It was because there was this action. And yet at the same time, we really saw it as like, this idea that you won the battle, but the war persists. So that's what we tried to portray by showing Claudio when he went to the end of the film is Claudio going in for his regular check-in. And he's nervous because now he's in the new administration. There's this rhetoric against immigrants, in the media and from the president. And so you don't know what's going to happen when he goes in. And in fact, the film ends not knowing. The story continues in reality, but that's kind of the sensation we were going for. It's like, you won this battle, but let's see what happens next. But you should talk about what happened after that.
Yeah, so that was our intention with the ending, was to present it as a mix of, like she's saying, the aftermath of the victory, but instability and not knowing, the storm clouds on the horizon, the Trump administration, things obviously unresolved. Cristina was there filming Claudio going to that check-in at the end. And and he didn't know if he'd come out, we didn't know, but he came out, but the not knowing, because he would have to go to another check-in, the not knowing is what we wanted to leave people with. And then after the film premiered at Sundance and won awards, Claudio had another one of these check-ins and he didn't come out. It was almost 2 years ago to this day, February, I think it's February 27th, that he went in for this check-in after the film premiered, after the film was in the national news, and then ICE detained him. And then we went through the surreal experience of kind of reliving the film, reliving the campaign to free Claudio again, working with the activists on a campaign to try to get him out. Representative Deutsch, who had, been in the story in multiple ways, became a focus of the activists' efforts, and he ultimately issued a private bill, which is like a piece of legislation to give legal status to Claudio. But this was, the Republicans controlled I believe they controlled the House at that point. This was in 2019. I believe they controlled the House, if not. But anyway, I forget. But in any case, it was the legislation didn't go anywhere. But long story short, Claudio was ultimately deported. He was deported about 2 years ago. He spent about a month in detention again. And the fact pattern of his detention and deportation looks like it was retribution for him appearing in the film, because he actually had a lot of good things going on in his case with ICE. His lawyers did not expect for him to be detained. So he sued DHS, we sued DHS, the ACLU represented us in a First Amendment case. He's got a First Amendment case going. His case is still alive in court. It just had a fascinating hearing in the 11th Circuit at the appeals level, right beneath the Supreme Court. And decision is due soon. But this film now has traveled through 3 administrations. The original action of the infiltration under the Obama administration. Claudio was punished by the Trump administration when the film was released under Trump. And here we are under Biden, actively trying to bring Claudio back, working with him and his family and his legal team to bring him back. We have a letter circulating based in the film community, but not exclusive to us, around the issue of ICE retribution and calling on the Biden administration to explicitly prohibit ICE from targeting immigrants in retaliation for their speech, and furthermore, to bring back to the US and undo that targeting, undo the chilling effect and the attack on the community by bringing back immigrants who faced this illegal retribution in the past. And so I'll put the link to that sign-on letter if people feel motivated to sign on in the chat.
Yeah, one quick detail I wanted to add to what Alex is saying is that when Claudio was detained at Chrome this time, a different, more secure detention center, when we went to go visit him, he showed us this piece of paper against the glass. It was like, this glass, just like you see when you visit an inmate in a jail. And it was listing all the names of people who were in there unjustly that he was discovering that he wanted to pass to the activists. I mean, he was still organizing. So it's been a hard time for him, his family, for him. But one of the things that he says is that what keeps him going is the ability to tell his story.
Yeah, and I'm so sorry to hear that in particular about Claudio. I mean, I'm sure I speak for many people here, in thanking you for representing these struggles from the 2010s, which of course gesture back. There are ways in which these struggles had been happening in advance of your working on the film, obviously, and they certainly kind of project into the future. So, we have at least one question in the chat just asking you about your thoughts about where things stand in the immigrant rights efforts today. And since you mentioned that this is now it's in its 3rd administration in some sense, from Obama to Trump to Biden, would you be willing to say a few words about how you see things today in 2021 and where things are going?
Yeah, it's, again, we could have a whole hour on this, but just a couple things. Like, one is the National Immigrant Youth Alliance. I believe history should say that they played a kind of, again, a revolutionary role in highlighting the executive power that, you know, we're almost used to it now because Trump was so insane with the executive orders. He made so many kind of just gonzo executive orders, ban Muslims, you know, ban refugees, just left and right, no laws, no Congress, just bam, bam, bam from the executive branch. But that really wasn't happening in immigration matters in any like kind of, I don't think in any kind of like, in this kind of extreme ways. It was the Dreamers who, when the DREAM Act failed, put their bodies on the line and demanded executive action from Obama. And he finally delivered in the third or fourth year of his administration, towards the end of his first term. He'd been in office for years and years, record deportations. And it was only because of this massive pressure campaign that he took out his pen and issued DACA, you know, and started to try to give some relief to immigrants through executive power. Obviously, Trump comes in and uses the same executive power to put all kinds of hurt on immigrants. But we're starting the Biden administration. Biden can't say he doesn't have that power. Obama played hide the pinky for 3 or 4 years. He was like, I don't have that power. He would say over and over again for those first 3 years, I don't have a magic wand. You know, well, now we're starting this new administration. We know he has the magic wand. Biden has executive power. He's already started to use it to undo some of the Trump stuff, but what else can be done? You know, and so I think there's a moment of opportunity because hopefully, I think the activist community has self-educated now to know that they cannot say we don't have the power. So Biden should be made to own every deportation and every detention center that's open every day because he has the power to change that. And I think that that knowledge has been built up now. So we're starting the Biden administration with an activist community that has that knowledge. That seems exciting to me. We'll see how it plays out. Also, I think there's a ton of education that happened thanks to Trump's brazen, again, I don't mean to say that Trump is the bad one and Obama was the good, not at all, but Trump's brazenness with his racism has, I think, onboarded a lot of Americans to care, to understand that what a detention center is, that even detention centers are, that they even exist. People know now. So I think there's an asset there in terms of this broad knowledge. So I think there's an opportunity here in terms of the broad public awareness about the immigration system as a violent one. There's all the racial awakening and the general attack and questioning of these so-called, justice systems, but the system of human caging. There's a broader awareness of that. There's broader awareness of the executive powers. So I think all of this together on day one of Biden puts us in an interesting place. And I think the Infiltrators as a film, it had a lot to offer under the Obama administration. I have to speak for myself. It was confusing for me what it had to offer under Trump, other than as like a kind of looking in the rearview mirror, like that was an interesting time. But under Trump, this kind of advocacy work that the film depicts, we failed. I mean, we lived through a ferocious campaign to try to stop Claudio's deportation under Trump and failed. I don't know of a lot of advocacy campaigns, individual immigrant advocates trying to get ICE to administer positive discretion under Trump that won. I don't think it was happening broadly, but it can happen now. So I think the film can hopefully serve as like a educating and a sort of propagandistic document to detail how these campaigns can function. So anyways, I think all of this together makes it like, not being Pollyannish, but hopefully I think it's a time of some possibility, I think.
Yeah, among those possibilities is the idea of being able to bring the most experienced voices to the negotiating table and trying to figure out like how to solve the problem of immigration reform. And those are the undocumented people themselves, bring them to the table. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Cristina. I was gonna say something similar, immigrants in the lead in these struggles. And I think that's one of the many things the film manages to do so well. A couple more questions before we conclude. Was it obvious from the beginning that this film would be called The Infiltrators? How did you think about that? Did you consider other ways of imagining what this would be called, and if so, why?
Once we decided on the central event being the Broward infiltration, it became pretty clear that that was the title. And I don't remember ever discussing it with you, any other title. Like that's just,
Yeah, no, we never really did. I mean,
Yeah.
I think maybe the infiltrating Broward, infiltrating ICE. I mean, but the idea of an infiltrator itself is just, it seemed yeah, so it seemed cool. Like the just
Yeah,
the
that's
language, there's a certain
yeah.
level at which like you're just
Just the style.
just the style and the kind of marketing aspect of it. I hate to put it that way, but there is that. And the idea of like an immigration film that doesn't have like A Better Life or El Norte, these are great films. I like those films, but the titles are kind of like wearing the heart on the sleeve. And this one, you know, we're gonna show you our intestines on our sleeve or something else. Like it's gonna be darker and more complicated. And
Oh, I like it. It's a bit Marvel movie. I mean, there's
Yeah.
I like that. I'm ready. I'm ready for the action figures or whatever. So yeah. So
Nice.
that wasn't a critique. I just wondered how you had thought about that, because it does. I don't have other titles for you, but I just wondered. It just occurred to me that you might have been thinking along these lines. You know, we have a couple questions just from current or aspiring filmmakers who admire what you do, I think. And for example, one person is an cultural anthropologist and wonders if you have any thoughts for them about how to work with, how to develop I think a film of relatively modest length on a small budget, you know, and how to work with a modest budget and a crew given, you know, given the constraints that that they're working with. We also have another filmmaker who asks about how to craft truthful and emotional stories without falling into rhetorical trappings of immigrants as helpless or agentless, or even on the other hand, heroic. You might have been speaking to that a bit in your past answer about infiltrators, but those kinds of things that, you know, people are asking as filmmakers themselves, what you might say.
Yeah, no, these are great questions. I mean, that's really where it starts, right? Is with the question, and to be able to ask how to have a three-dimensional portrayal of someone is you know, even including immigrants, you know, it's really important. So I just think that I'm not sure how to give advice except for don't lose sight of that question, you know, as you're moving forward and crafting the stories. What I would say is, yeah, and the idea of crafting a story on modest budget, you know, that I would need
Well,
more.
Cristina, let me ask you, is there anything from your own personal history? I mean, is there a tidbit of how you made it happen? I mean, given, as you said, you were in this to go to law school and then somehow made the transition.
Yeah, I know. So for me, what I did for my first film is I applied for a development grant, and I used that development grant to shoot the whole film. But it's because I didn't pay anybody, you know, everyone's just like, I used my family, and I tried to, you know, get help from people who just wanted to volunteer. I guess I don't know how to advise somebody who's starting out, because it's not very fair.
Well, I think it just really depends on what kind of a film
Yeah.
you're making and what you're doing. You know, but if like for both of us, I think the original gesture, like if you cared ever to look at our first films, you'd see filmmakers who were really trying to get a voice out. It was really both of our films. Mine was a documentary, her first was a fiction, but both of them are highly written. And so it's really about finding a voice, and the voice of a film, you know, can come out in many different ways, you know, but for us, it was very written in terms of writing voiceover, writing a script. And I think both of us, in the case of being Latino filmmakers, there's a small body of Latino film, but there's more Latino literature, there's more Latino theory.
Yeah.
So just getting involved in like
That's good advice.
finding other texts that inspire you. Maybe it's another film, but it's better if it's not a film. It's better if there's a book that inspires you, or an article, or a person in your family, whatever it is that inspires you and that you write in reaction to. If you're writing a true story, you're synthesizing it into, if you're writing a kind of fiction. But it's the thing that is most valuable about a filmmaker is the voice. And it's also the thing that costs nothing, because it's like about your writing, and it can always live in the audio. You know, you always have the audio to turn to. and audio production is simple and cheap. And so, anyways, I think you'd see that in our work, that a highlighting of the voiceover, the scripted voice as a place to sort of retreat to. And I don't mean retreat like to safety, but a place that you can always go to. You can say, oh, my film isn't working. Well, have you tried a voiceover? Because a well-written, not a shitty voiceover, but a well-written one,
That these words echo.
can be
Try
so
voiceover.
transformative, you know, in grounding something in a subjectivity, in grounding something in a voice, in a spirit. And you always have that option. So I think, I don't know if that's helpful, but I would just say, like, think thoughtfully and creatively about what you're doing in your audio world, read and write. And in terms of like making three-dimensional characterizations, I'd say be aware, try to really do some deep reflection on the histories of the representations you're intervening in. For example, if you're doing a film about a single mom, you know, what are the representations of single motherhood? You know, what is the history of that? What are the politics of that? Carry that into your process. Be aware of if what you're observing lines up with that, disrupts it. But try to always shake those things a little bit and go into the places that you're, that maybe you don't think to ask first. You know, find those bulletin boards of the mind. Find those the small things, the details that are never captured in these stereotypes and stuff. So I don't know. I think there's, anyways, a couple thoughts there.
Yeah, and you're inspiring me to think about one more tool that might be helpful, which is to mix media. Like if you have a placeholder for something, you have a modest budget, so you're putting in like some archival or something just as a holder. Sometimes that will become even better than the original idea you had. And you know, for example, we kept our Department of Defense footage that we're using as placeholders. We just used it in a different way, but it was. That can be inspiring. I had home movies that I used, and they ended up being integral to the film. So yeah, I would say just mix it up with media to tell the stories. Like, but everything you said is great. You know, like the voices first.
Yeah, that is great. We're winding down here. I have two more questions at least, and then, you know, give you a minute at the end if I didn't raise anything that you think we should have talked about. But it's kind of a two-part question. It plays a little bit off of, you know, Marco at the end of the film says, I definitely have more hesitancy now than I did back then. In other words, he was remembering his courage of the past and wondering if he'd still have it today. So, you know, my two-part question for you both is, you know, where are you finding your courage and your inspiration these days? I mean, Alex, you were talking about, you know, the importance of reading and, you know, finding, you know, guides and voices and, you know, prompts and probably courage from things. And so whether it's things like readings or other arts, or whether it's people or organizations, you know, what are you all paying attention to right now? And, you know, with the second part of the question in mind, which is what are you all working on right now? Several people in the chat are wondering about current projects that you may be undertaking these days.
You know, I'll answer that first, and then I'm going to have to just jump off, and Alex can finish it up. I'm sorry about that, but thank you for asking. I mean, for me right now, what's really inspiring is my family, my daughter and my parents, my sister, and I'm really interested in this moment that where everyone is shifting how we work, and we're forced to do it because we can't continue with the structures as they have been. I'm interested in really exploring my homeland, the border, from their perspective, and looking at post-massacre. You know, there was this massacre where white supremacists went to El Paso, Texas, to kill Mexicans, specifically Mexicans. It's, you know, that we just celebrated it. That's, you know, we just honored the anniversary of that in El Paso, and I guess I'm interested in a documentary that will define border identity during moments of crisis, like especially like now we have the pandemic that we're dealing with. So I'm going back and looking at maybe through my family as the entry point, through my dad's junkyard, through, you know, my sister's medicine practice, you know, just like finding connecting points of like what is the border identity today, and how can it teach us how to get through these post, you know, this time frame that we're living through right now. Then anyway, No, it's not very clear yet. It's the beginnings of a documentary. But thank you so much. I hate to
That's okay.
leave, but thank you.
Thank you,
Let
Cristina.
Alex wind it up for us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, right on. And let's see, in terms of inspiration and strength and those kinds of things, I mean, I've been reading Kelly Lytle Hernandez's books, and through her books, she has a book that I've been reading recently called City of Inmates, which is a history of Southern California through the lens of human caging. So she just looks at this region where we're in. I'm in Southern California here, and just the history of putting people in cages here, and she starts, you know, pre-contact with the Tongva cultures in this region and how they dealt with harm, I guess, because it wasn't defined as criminality, but how they dealt with it and how the Spanish dealt as they came. And it's kind of a sweeping history of this region, and ultimately a region that was really crucial in both the development of immigration detention and obviously prisons and jails. And in her book, though, she talks about stuff I knew about the early history of immigration enforcement, immigration restriction, which is all around the time of Chinese exclusion, but a lot of stories and characters and people I didn't know about, including the Chinese litigants who fought against deportation and who fought against detention. And in the case of some like Fang Yue Ting, who was a laundryman who was he was a test case for the constitutionality of deportation. So after Chinese exclusion, immigrants were told they had to register or face deportation. He organized with these basically immigrant support groups, Chinese immigrant support groups, to not register and to walk into the office and say, we're not registering, and what are you going to do? And to create a test case that went all the way to the Supreme Court to test whether or not it was constitutional for this government to lock somebody up against their will, to put them on a vessel and send them to China against their will. And the story of is fascinating. And after the Infiltrators, I guess, I spoke earlier about how I thought their actions were like world historic in terms of undocumented civil disobedience. I think in some ways that is true, but I think it's also true that there has been immigrant resistance through this whole regime, because obviously Fang Yue Ting in I believe it was like 1886 or so, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they made a conservative argument against deportation, saying that there's nowhere in the Constitution that the power of deportation is articulated. There's nowhere, the word deportation doesn't appear in the Constitution anywhere, and nothing like it appears. So in any case, like I've been interested in maybe making a film that explores that time period and those cases in particular, those people. And I'm just drawing like inspiration, and I guess like, from the idea that, because spoiler alert, I guess, in the Supreme Court, it was a 6-3 decision, I believe, in favor of the power to deport. But that means 3 Supreme Court justices in the late 1800s, 3 of them said, you know what, there should be no deportation in our society at all. And this was a notoriously, backwards court whose decisions have been overturned since then, almost in their entirety. And 3 of these, white men Supreme Court justices said there should be no such thing as deportation in our society at all. And it's kind of remarkable to read those dissents. And so in this time period of like abolition kind of imaginings, to return to that particular court case and that particular moment in time where the practice of deportation was almost stopped before it started, it's possible. It's not crazy. 3 of them back then thought it was not crazy. Anyways, so I'm finding that fascinating. In terms of what I'm working on, I've actually got my first Hollywood writing job, and I'm writing it's not been announced yet, but I'm writing a sort of science fiction reboot of a classic masked Avenger of the Borderlands, there's not many of them. So if you know American popular culture, you probably know which masked avenger of the borderlands I'm talking about, but they want to do a sort of science fictional reboot. So I'm doing a sci-fi reboot of this character set like 5 minutes into the future, where the character is basically confronting a kind of conspiracy between immigration enforcement and big data and sort of surveillance. And the character is kind of a teen hacker who's going at this conspiracy. So anyways, it's like Mr. Robot meets Batman Begins meets me. So that's what I'm working on.
Well, Alex, I mean, everything you do, as far as I can tell, is amazing. And the same goes for Cristina. You know, I think of you both as just amazing students of the world, you know, artists, analysts, social critics, who also managed to bring so many people along with you and to amplify the voices of people whose voices really need to be amplified. So I can't wait to see everything that you do and everything that Cristina does in the coming years. It's incredibly exciting. And to hear the shout out to an academic's, you know, Kelly Lytle Hernandez, and that academic work is really exciting. And I'll just put on your radar, if it's not already there, Adam Goodman, another historian, has a great new book called The Deportation Machine, which also tells that history of the rise of the deportation machine, but also fights against it, beginning with Chinese exclusion. And he dates this to Truckee in Northern California in the 1870s and 1880s. So it's a kind of complementary story to the one that you told. But you know, we're in good hands with you and with Cristina, and I want to thank you so much for sharing the Infiltrators with us and with the world, and for talking so eloquently about the work that both of you have been doing in recent years. And I'll take this opportunity also to thank again CSREA at Brown for organizing this event and hosting this event. It's you know, illustrative of the kind of work that center does for the Brown community and so many of us. So thank you to everybody for joining us. Thank you to Cristina and Alex. Be well, and we hope to connect with you and see everything that you do in the years to come.
Thank you all. Thank you all. And thank you in academia for keeping our films alive, for opening these dialogues, and for producing knowledge. We need it to flow from academia, pop culture, experimental arts. It needs to all be an ecosystem of revolution and revelation. But it's so good. This is what this is what it can be. So thank you all. And I'm grateful to be connected to you all. So thank you.